Hi, and welcome back for another edition of Story Time. Today's story is called The Shop on a Square. And The Shop on the Square is an odd little story, and it definitely had a very odd genesis to it. It is from my collection, Traveling Left of Center and Other Stories. So after I read you the excerpt, I'll tell you a little bit about how the idea of the story came to me. The Shop on the Square. The dirt road was bare and rutted. Bedraggled chickens scattered before the car's approach, the only sign of life in this isolated Mexican town. The young man stopped the car and stepped out into the oppressive stillness. Heat and dust surrounded him, settling into the creases of his gray trousers, on his eyelashes, and in his mouth. Everything tasted of the hot baking sun and the dry ground, and he had to swallow twice before his parched throat felt any relief. Squinting in the brightness, he saw a shop nearby. The open door invited him to enter, the shadowed interior promising escape from the relentless sun. After carefully locking his car against intruders and thieves, he moved toward the darkness. Inside the store, Mexican sombreros and brightly colored skirts hung on the walls, splayed out like three-dimensional paintings glowing against the whitewashed background. Everywhere he looked, there were items for sale heaped on scarred wooden tables, stacks of garishly painted pottery, and piles of serapes woven with the rays of dawn captured in their patterns. But the dust from the street had invaded the shelves, dulling the bright colors. The store seemed to have few visitors. Hardly surprising, he reflected, since he himself had stumbled across the town only because of several wrong turns during the long night of driving. What kind of people can live in a place like this, he wondered aloud. And as if in response, footsteps came from the silent darkness at the rear of the store, the shopkeeper coming to market her wares. A small dark figure emerged, black eyes sparkling in a dark face, black skirt, blacker hair. The absence of color should have depressed him, but strangely it did not. The darkness reinforced the idea of coolness. Bright colors meant heat, and he had had enough of that. Absently, still staring at the woman, the young man picked up a wooden figure from a nearby table. At that, the proprietress smiled quickly at him, her teeth a slash of brightness, and she quoted a figure that, even in Spanish, far exceeded the piece's value. No, he answered, and quickly set the piece down again. He was too hot and too tired for a lengthy bargaining session in which he might understand only every other word. Besides, he hadn't come to buy anything except a few hours of respite from the sun. I didn't come to buy, he said in halting Spanish, and shoved his hands into the pocket of his slacks as though to emphasize his words. But I would like to rest. It is so hot, and I'm so tired. Have you a room I could sleep in for just a few American dollars? He didn't want her to realize how desperately he needed to lie down and close his eyes against the sunlight. She smiled again and then nodded eagerly, as though her greatest desire was to provide strangers with a place to sleep away the afternoon hours. Siesta. With a sweep of her hand, she indicated an open doorway hung with a long striped blanket. You sleep. The English words sounded unfamiliar when she spoke them. Thank God, the young man thought, relieved as much by her understanding of his language as by her willingness to let him stay. After all, this place was a shop, not a hotel, and natives could be less than willing to offer hospitality to strangers. Maybe it was because he looked exhausted, or more likely, she must have seen his car, recognized him as a wealthy Norte-Americano, and was determined to extract what money she could from his fortuitous arrival. He pulled out his leather wallet, removing 5 ones from the stack neatly tucked inside. The shopkeeper's eyes gleamed, but she made no move to take the money. She just stood there patiently before him. Not enough? He asked, a touch of irritation in his voice. What was the going rate for a cheap bed in a dirt-poor Mexican village? Undoubtedly, it depended entirely on the desperation of the visitor. With a mental shrug, he pulled 2 more bills from the wad and then extended the money to the woman. For the room, he said, when she still made no move to take the money. Surely this must be enough for a room for just a few hours. But she only continued to smile in the dim light. He shoved his wallet back into his pocket, hoping she'd understand that was all the money he was willing to offer. If she didn't agree, he would leave. But the thought of tackling the desert in the heat of the day was almost more than he could accept. If only I had stayed in the city overnight, he thought for the 20th time. He could have resumed his journey in the cool morning hours and avoided getting lost in the darkness. He would never have ended up here in this godforsaken town, where a native intimidated him into offering 3 times the room's worth, just so he could escape the blazing sun and clinging dust that was Mexico. The room, come see it. She pulled at his arm, her strength surprising him given her age. Or was it only that he was exhausted and lacked the energy to resist? But the money. Her eyes gleamed once more as she looked at the bills he held tightly in his hand. No pay now, she answered. Later. When it is time. All visitors pay later. She turned, her gnarled hand still holding his arm, and moved toward the rear of the store. Visitors, he wondered? How many people came here, and why? So that is the excerpt from The Shop on the Square. As I said, it's a peculiar story, an odd story, and how it came about is even odder, although it is not the only story I've ever written that had this kind of a beginning. Basically, what it was I had this dream. All I can remember from the dream when I woke up was seeing the silhouette of several figures coming down a hill far in a distance, and they were leading a calf just with a rope, just taking it down, bringing it down. And somehow I knew that this was taking place in Mexico. Somehow I knew that they were bringing the calf to town. That's all I did know. I'd never been to Mexico, ever. I had no idea what it was like. I had no idea why were they bringing the calf to town, what was the purpose. It was evening, too, hence the silhouette. But there was just this sense of foreboding, the sense of something ominous was going to happen. You know, you have on the face of it, a perfectly innocent activity. A couple of villagers bringing the calf into the village. And yet there was just something about it that was wrong, that was off, that was portending of something that was going to happen. And I sat down and wrote the story. Had no idea who the young man was, had no idea what was going to happen. I did know that I did not want him to be a sympathetic character. I wanted him to be kind of a superior feeling person. You know, he was better than people around him, whether they were American or Mexican or any other nationality. He was, for himself, he had money, you know, not wealthy, but certainly had enough money. And like some people, thought that the money was enough to make him better than the rest of the world. So I wanted the story to kind of have that air, to kind of make you wonder what was going to happen. You know, how was this going to work? Was he going to remain the superior person he thought he was? Was he going to come to some realization? what kind of story was this going to end up being? And to be quite honest with you, until I finished the story, which I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but until I finished the story, I wasn't exactly sure how it was going to come to an end. You know, I just knew that there had to be something about the story. I knew it wasn't going to be a happily ever after story, that much I can tell you. But I just wanted it to be an intriguing story. Oh, maybe a little Twilight Zone-y for those of you who are familiar with that series that used to be on TV. Something a little bit odd, a little Shirley Jackson-ish for that matter. Just not your ordinary run-of-the-mill stories, because for the life of me, I cannot write an run-of-the-mill story, an ordinary story about ordinary people. What fun is that, right? I mean, you have to have odd little people having odd little experiences. So that is how the Shop on the Square came about. I was pretty pleased with it, and I would love it if you would take the opportunity to read it in full, see if you are equally pleased with how the story ended up and who you will end up rooting for. And if you do read it, drop me a line, send me an email, meet me on social media, tell me what you thought of it. Again, the Shop on the Square is from Traveling Left of Center and Other Stories. And in this particular case, he definitely traveled left of center. So thanks so much for joining me here for this week's episode of Storytime. And be sure to stop by again next week when there'll be another story. That one will be from Peripheral Visions and Other Stories. Thank you, and you have a great day. Bye-bye.